Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host, Jitendra. This conversation is with Gale Sinatra, who is a professor of psychology at University of Southern California. She has written a book with her colleague, Barbara Hofer, on psychology of science denial. In this conversation, we talk about why do people deny science? What is the difference between a skeptic and a science denier? What is the role of algorithms in science denial? How do culture and religion affect science denial? And what is the action plan to avoid science denial? So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you for listening. All right. Hi, Gail. Welcome to today's discussion.
Hi, thank you very much for having me, Jitendra. I'm very pleased to be with you here today.
That's great. So today we'll talk about psychology of science denial, and which is the book that you have written with Barbara Hofer. Let's start with where you end your book, which is this quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson: "The good thing about science is that it's true whether you believe it or not." So why is it true? What is science and why is it true?
That's an excellent question. So what science is a process. It's a process of investigating the natural world and how the natural world works. And the reason why it can come close to truth over time is that it is a community of researchers, and in that community over time, we weed out mistakes, we weed out even misleading or corrupt or false information, because it's self-correcting by the community who continues to search towards the answers to questions about how the natural world works. So that makes it different. It makes it different from belief systems, which generally have a set of beliefs which are pretty consistent over time and often not open to correction by members of the community. So that's what makes it different from other forms of knowledge.
Right. But then what is science denial? And there is another class of people which we call skeptic. So what is the difference between a skeptic and a science denier?
Well, that's an excellent question. So one thing that we're very clear about in the book is there aren't, an us and them here. There isn't a science denier and a science acceptor. We are all what we call cafeteria deniers. In other words, even the people who go to a flat earth convention fly in on a plane and then tweet about it on their cell phone. So individuals tend to pick and choose what they accept and do not accept. So full scale 100% science denial is very rare and unusual. Instead, most people, even people who would purport to be science acceptors, tend to deny one or two or another type of finding. And that's very typical. So it isn't an us or them sort of thing. It's really a matter of how each of us approaches scientific evidence with an open mind and a willingness to change our mind, which Lee McIntyre calls a scientific attitude. And that's what we want to promote. Skepticism is healthy and a part of natural science. You said you're a biologist. And so if there was a find that really changed the course of how we view evolution, you should probably be skeptical at first until that find is confirmed, other people have examined it, until people can replicate what information we found about that. So skepticism is a healthy and normal part of the scientific process and serves an actual very positive purpose. When skepticism can run amok is when skepticism is used to deny everything. So, you can't be skeptical of everything, because a new scientific finding you should be skeptical of doesn't mean we should be skeptical of the intergovernmental panel report on climate change, the IPCC, that just came out a few weeks ago, has a tremendous amount of research from a large number of scientists, and that we should not be skeptical of. We should see that that is more what we call consensus science. So skepticism of a small, unique one-off study with low sample size, yeah, that is an important part of science. But skepticism of all science, even that which has been replicated and confirmed over and over again, that's not a great approach for scientific knowledge.
Yes, that's certainly true. But I think here we should also talk about the factors which are leading to science denial. Why is it happening? I mean, I'm sure that especially with the internet, most of us, we are getting the same information. So that the resources are same. So is it like the way we are approaching the information, or it's something more?
Well, I would not agree with you that the sources are the same. So algorithms, which are the proprietary technological techniques that social media platforms use to feed information to people, create a different feed for you on Facebook than they do for me on Facebook. So these are tailored. They're tailored to what you have clicked on before, and they're tailored to what I've clicked on before. And this is even true within Google searches. So it isn't true that we're all seeing the same information. In fact, people are in information bubbles where when they search for information, they get more confirming information to their prior searches than they do information that conflicts with that information that they previously have searched. And so, if you're someone who's read a lot about dinosaurs and humans existing at the same time, which they did not, and you've searched for that many times, if you get on today and open up a new window and search again, those sources will pop right up to the top of your feed. So it isn't true that we're getting all the same information. You might find a very different set of information coming your way. And so that's a real problem. The internet has democratized information for sure, but it's also democratized misinformation.
Right, but then is it the way we are approaching the information means we have certain set of prejudice or certain set of, set variables, the way we want that information to access?
Well, exactly. So most everybody's heard of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is that maybe you have a pre-existing idea about a scientific concept, like maybe you think the vaccine causes infertility, so you're concerned about that. So then you Google, does the vaccine cause infertility? Depending on what you've searched last, you may find the very first 2-3 citations that come up are in fact confirming that preconceived notion. So if you believe that going in and you see it in the next search, then that will confirm your pre-existing idea. And you feel like you've done your research, but in fact, you've been misled by these algorithms that really support confirmation bias rather than showing you different sources and, of course, more reliable sources to debunk that misconception.
Right. But then the point is that are we reaching to a point where we can sort of, let's say, if we talk about it, still we can change the way people look for the information? Or is it about policy making where we need to somehow give more variation in the information once people are searching for it?
Well, it's definitely both. We've recently seen here in the United States, and a former employee of Facebook who came forward and testified about these algorithms that drive mis and disinformation. And that is very worrisome. And obviously, we need some kinds of policies about the monetization of misinformation. It's one thing if you are confused and you don't know the answer to a scientific question, and so you share that misinformation you found with a friend on Facebook. You do that maybe unwittingly, but it's very different when the companies are actually pushing you towards misinformation. And that's what these algorithms are doing. So there is no question that we need a change in the structure of how information is allowed to be pushed towards you online that is just flat out false. In addition to that, we need to teach students and members of the public how to search reliably for information. One of the things I encourage people to do is, if you're searching for something, is to be accuracy driven instead of looking for things to confirm your prior beliefs. So we talk about motivated reasoning in the book. Motivated reasoning means you can either be motivated towards a desired conclusion, or you can be motivated to reason towards an accurate conclusion. So keep an open mind, be motivated towards an accurate conclusion instead of just one that confirms your prior beliefs. And then maybe open up a window in the incognito mode, which means you're disguising what you've searched for before. Don't just read the first couple of sites, but read down and then do that again. That's something called lateral reading. Instead of vertical, you read across. In other words, open up several windows. And then, of course, check the source. And if it's research, where was that research funded? If you're looking for research on pesticides and the source that says, oh, don't worry about pesticides on your vegetables, and you find that the research was sponsored by Monsanto, that's very different than if it was a government-funded study. So you really have to learn how to look for the source of information and analyze the reliability of that source, the potential motivation or vested interest of that source. My colleague Doug Lombardi and I have an article in the Educational Psychologist for your academic audience that talks about how to teach students these sourcing techniques. And for the general public audience, the News Literacy Project in the United States is a wonderful NGO that produces curriculum materials for teachers to teach their students in K through 12 settings how to search for reliable information. So it's both. We must change the way information is shared with people from a structural point on these platforms, and we have to help people learn how to search for reliable scientific information online.
Yes, indeed. And in the book, you also shared this one example where school-going students, they were showed the experiments for the climate change, and they could understand the. Maybe you can also share that.
Sure. So that might be the study that Doug Lombardi and I conducted. And what we do with that particular study is we share with students two models, and we have them evaluate these two models against the evidence. So in one study, using this kind of instructional scaffold we call a model evidence link diagram, we had students compare the human-induced climate change model that shows that humans are making an impact on climate to a skeptic model, which was increased solar radiation, which people who are climate skeptics are often touting as causal factor. And then there's pieces of evidence, and the students must judge those pieces of evidence against the model. Does it support the model, or does it not support the model, or is it not relevant to the model? And as students go through this, they form plausibility judgments. How plausible is this model to be correct? And what we find is when they weigh these pieces of evidence against the two models, they eventually do see that the evidence is in fact more consistent with the scientific model. And this is the kind of slow, deliberative, what we call system 2 thinking that you want to do about scientific evidence. We often are in system 1 mode, as Daniel Kahneman calls these two different modes. System 1 is this short, quick, reflexive model. That's what you want to employ when you see a bouncing ball out in front of your car. You want to brake real quickly before a child runs after it. And that's great because you need that quick response and reaction. But that's not the model that you want to use when you are evaluating scientific evidence. That's when you want to be deliberative, slow, thoughtful, think about alternative evidence, confirming, disconfirming. That kind of judgment requires system 2 thinking. So we need to know before we click on a piece of science news online and share it that we should stop and think carefully about it. Twitter has started to suggest when you click on an article you haven't read that perhaps you might want to read it first before you share it. And that's a small but important step because it reminds people that you really need to be thoughtful before you share information.
Right. I have one example here where, for example, one simple observation that anyone can pick is that most Nobel Prize are given to men. So anyone can think that the means probably men are more smart, et cetera, but once you look at the data, you will see that it's only 3 or 4 women have gotten the Nobel Prize in past more than 100 years. So to also analyze the data carefully, and but the point is that are we able to, or especially all of us, are we able to analyze that data, or there is or it varies from people to people?
Well, sure. I mean, that's really hard, right? Because even finding the data that you just mentioned, what does that mean? That might lead someone to conclude, well, see, there you go. Men are definitely smarter, right? Because they had more Nobel Prizes. But you would really have to understand some context about how the prize is given. And backing up for there, you'd have to understand that women have not always and still don't have today the same access to research careers in science, the same support, the same number of grants. And so those structural factors may not be evident to someone who searches online, how do men win more Nobel Prizes than women? So even when you find correct information, you may not have the context to interpret that information. Maybe you just don't have the right information around the thing you're searching for. But then there's some types of information you can't get access to. People are always saying, do your own research, but what does that mean? I mean, it means Googling it and watching a YouTube video, and that's probably not going to be sufficient to understand climate change or how the mRNA vaccines work against the coronavirus. So that's something that probably would be very difficult to understand just from searching. My nephew is an infectious disease doctor, and he's always saying, if you want to do your own research on vaccines, go right ahead. It'll just take 6 years of medical school.
Yes, that brings us to another important point, which is the scientific experts. What we especially noticed during pandemic time that there were scientists, not virologists, but they were still coming out giving their opinions on on viruses, how to control COVID-19, and et cetera, et cetera. So who is a scientific expert, and how to find them, or where to find them?
That is such a good question. In the beginning stages of the pandemic, people were weighing in who may have not had the right expertise. A scientist who is someone who works in a different area than infectious disease may not be up to speed on the latest mRNA technology, even though they're scientists. So even being a scientist and being well educated doesn't necessarily make you an expert. So, science has gotten so complex and so deep in its knowledge that expertise is a very important thing to understand. You really want an infectious disease doctor, not necessarily like an orthopedic, who is perhaps very knowledgeable about bones, but may not be as knowledgeable about infectious disease. So even doctors and scientists with specialized knowledge may not have the right expertise. That's how refined knowledge in science and medicine has become. So when you're looking for experts, it's definitely important to find people who are in the exact area that you are looking for information on. And then one of the things that's most important is really looking at the consensus science. So you can find a doctor who's against vaccines. You can find a doctor who's against anything. So one person here or there can have a contrary view. And that if that confirms your preconceived notion, that's probably not the best way to go. What you really want is to see what's the consensus view across the experts. So for example, we know that over 97% of scientists who are in the climate field understand the role of humans in producing global warming. So those are the experts you want to look to, and that's an overwhelming consensus view. So we have to look for expertise, and we have to do it because we can't do this research on our own as citizens. I'm not going to go measure ocean acidification. I'm not in a position to do that. I can't measure ice cores. I can't measure how many glaciers are melting. I mean, that isn't something I have access to. So we must trust experts, but we have to evaluate carefully who are those experts. And we don't trust individuals. We trust the consensus science across all the experts.
Yes. And this consensus science, of course, it should be communicated to the general public. And this is where the role of communicators come. But then here, another interesting thing is the simplification of science, because if you're communicating science to the people who don't understand science, you can't really go with the same data that you have. You need to sort of simplify it. So how much or what is the role of simplification of science? And can we really do it?
It's such a great question. It is very hard because, as I mentioned, mRNA technology is really confusing and difficult to understand. You have to have a pretty good understanding of genetics to follow the logic of how those vaccinations work. And genetics is not an easy thing to understand in and of itself. And you know that as a biologist. So it is very difficult when you get into sophisticated, complex scientific topics to communicate about them in an accessible way to the general public. You can use things like metaphors and analogies. And the minute you do that, of course, it's not going to be 100% correct because no metaphor or analogy can be. So you have to be thoughtful about how much can you drift away from perfectly correct to better communicate to people so that they can grasp the essence of the concept, but without being misleading. And that is a difficult and fine line to walk. And certainly scientists don't like to do that because they would like to be correct, as well they should. But I think we do have to think about metaphors that help bridge people to the correct information, analogies that bridge people to the correct information. I heard a infectious disease doctor say that the mRNA vaccine is like sending an email to your immune system that says, hey, be on the lookout for this virus if it comes your way. And, obviously that's nothing like what really happens, but it does give you a sense of the information that the mRNA shares with your system. So if you can provide analogies that are clearly not exactly how it works and be clear that that's not exactly how it works, but help people to understand what you mean by that. And that's a bridge towards the correct scientific understanding.
Right. And is there any study that the using of charts or certain figures, animations, it helps in science communication?
Yes, of course. Visualizations are very well investigated, as are charts and graphs, for the communication of scientific information. But at the same time, they can be misleading as well. If a chart or graph is you've probably seen charts that are mislabeled or somehow don't have the right information on them, that can actually be worse, because now you can spread misinformation. But yes, obviously visualizations, animations, charts, graphs, when done well and are accurate representations of the information, can help convey the scientific information. And, scientists need to communicate more about their work and not just leave it to others. And I know that scientists are wanting to do that, but aren't always trained to do that. More and more, they are learning to do that, but it's really important to hear directly from the scientists who have to be more versed in communicating directly to the public. Information gets translated by science communicators and science journalists, and they do fabulous jobs, but there's not enough of them. So we do need to hear more directly from scientists who need to be well-trained in communicating their work to the general public.
Yes, also because scientists are, most of them are those creatures spending, a lot of time in the labs and also feeling awkward to talk to different people. And when it comes to science communication, it gets even more difficult, that how to really explain the concept of evolution to your grandmother, for example. I mean, at least right now. So yeah, but then is it because of like we already have some information? So for example, learning from scratch, then starting it with already certain information, which probably it's also something that may create a problem when it comes to understanding science.
Absolutely. So there's few topics in science where we don't already have some preconceived notion about how it works. And unfortunately, a lot of those preconceived notions are incorrect. I mean, just think about, the sun sets, we say the sun rises and sets. Well, of course, it doesn't really rise and set. And our experience is the Earth is flat, right? Because we walk on a flat surface, but of course the Earth is not flat. So these are common everyday experiences, and our common everyday experiences sort of lead us to incorrect ideas about science and how science works. And so it's rare that people don't already have some sense of a scientific concept, but unfortunately the sense they may have of it from their everyday experience is probably incorrect and probably not how the science works. I'll recommend to your listeners an excellent book on this called Science Blind by my colleague Andrew Stolman from Occidental College here in Southern California. And he describes how we have these notions in many different areas of science, including evolution, that really come with our everyday experience and are in conflict with the way science actually works. And so it is a struggle for people to overcome those prior notions and learn the scientific information. And that's what we call conceptual change. You have to change your preconceived notion. And that's a harder thing than just learning new information.
Right. Well, this also brings us to another important question, which is rationality. Do we have it? Are we rational? Are we really able to understand information and distinguish what makes sense and what not?
Well, we certainly have the capability to be rational, but that means the kind of system two thinking I was talking about earlier, where we weigh information against alternatives, where we analyze, think deliberatively, that kind of thinking we are capable of doing for sure, but we have to do it in a very deliberate manner. Our sort of default is to walk around in system one through our day, We are described as cognitive misers. That is, we really don't want to expend the energy. And to be fair, you really can't expend high-level deliberative thinking energy all day long. You'd be exhausted by the end of the day and probably have a hard time just getting to work. But you have to know when to employ that system to deliberative thinking. And that's when you are evaluating scientific evidence that makes a difference to you in your life, as to something like whether to get a vaccine. That's something that you really do want to spend the time thinking carefully about and trying very hard to find good information and checking your sources, those kinds of things that are really worth doing for important decisions.
Yes, Daniel Kahneman's work is really interesting. About system 1 and system 2. Let's elaborate a bit, and like how something like system 1 and system 2 would evolve, and what are the examples, if there are other examples from nature.
Well, absolutely. Our system 1 is probably the earlier part of the brain that evolved and is probably much more prominent in all animals, right? That's that reflection, that reflective, quick response that will save you from getting eaten by something else. And so certainly that was an important and early part of brain evolution. And it really wasn't until much later in our becoming human history where we evolved that prefrontal cortex, which allows that kind of reflection. And we don't believe that all animals have that capability. Humans do have that capability when we utilize it, and we should utilize it in those circumstances that are important to us.
Yes. Here, let's talk about the of course your work on evolution, how people take it, and how we can really communicate with them. But then also we can talk about cultural implications on understanding science.
Yes, I really came into the study of science through the study of evolution. I was doing a study on evolution, and I gave it to some students, a text on human evolution, and I was stunned to see the degree to which it really was difficult for them to wrestle with this information. And Barbara was doing a similar study, my co-author on the book, at the same time, and we've both got examples of students saying things like, if I were to believe evolution, who would I be? Or how could I go home and talk to my family about this? Or if I were to believe that I'm related to an animal, I'd have no reason to go on living. And what you see in all of these examples is the strong evoking of identity. So if you have a certain identity of yourself as a special creation, and you then hear a biological interpretation of human history as we're just one of the animals like other animals, and we are special in certain ways, for sure. And that's that prefrontal cortex we talked about. But we probably came about, according to evolution, the same way that other species have. And that's very difficult for people to understand, whose identity is wrapped into special creation. So one way that we've approached that in my research with individuals like Pat Hawley in Texas, who's taught teachers about how to teach evolution in an evangelical community, and Sarah Brownell and Liz Barnes from Arizona State University, where they have worked with college students of faith, particularly evangelical Christians, learning about evolution. And in both of these cases, what we do is we bring in people of faith who are scientists, who are biologists, who talk about their faith and how they have resolved issues of their faith along with science. And you don't have to give up their faith. Famously, the head of the NIH in the United States, who was Francis Collins, who was one of the main architects of the sequencing human genome, is a person of faith. Another example would be Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist, is a strong person of faith and an evangelical Christian. Another example would be Ken Miller, who wrote a book called Finding Darwin's God. He's an evolutionary biologist and a Catholic. So you can find examples over and over again of people who are resolved in their faith and understand that science asks and answers different questions about only the natural world, and that should not have to conflict with people's faith. And many people have found that it does not have to.
Right. Last week, I had a conversation with Lee McIntyre as well. And what he mentioned is that during his, when he attended this Flat Earth convention, most of the people were also religious. So is it like, how significant is the role of religion in science denial? Is there any study for this?
Well, yes, in fact, it is a factor, but as I've just mentioned, it doesn't have to be. It's the same with politics. There's a differential acceptance of science based on political points of view, and that doesn't have to be either. So I think it really depends on how people have been introduced into the community of religion or of politics as to the degree to which it's in conflict. If you look at Pope, I think it was John Paul in the Catholic Church, who had written about evolution and had no problem with human evolution. And his interpretation is, God created the universe and everything in it, then evolution is in it, then he created evolution, and that was fine with him. I mean, that's paraphrasing a pope here, which is taking quite a bit of liberty, but people can look up his actual quote. So even leaders of faith can accept science because they know that the faith and ways of knowing through faith and ways of knowing through investigating the natural world are asking and answering different questions. And they are only put into conflict, I believe, by people who are trying to put them into conflict. If a religious leader like a pope can understand those distinctions and remain a person of faith, then certainly individuals can also understand and accept the differences between religion and science.
Right. Many scientists in about the faith, they sort of call it God of gaps. And the thing is that if we, of course, if we are accepting, or if we are saying that you can have your faith, but you can also believe in science. But the point is, are we already conflicting ourselves? Because science is about that rationality and empirical evidence, and trying to really evaluate the evidence, look for the evidence and evaluate it. But on the other hand, belief is, it's especially blind faith, which is you just take it for granted. The thing is that, of course, for the time being, we can say that maybe it's fine to have it, but at the end, what we really want is to have that the important value of science, or the scientific method that the people can use in their life, right? So is it
right? And faith serves a different role, right? So I would say, this is my personal opinion, that whether or not a vaccine is effective in treating coronavirus is a scientific question. But then there are moral questions that you could ask yourself, like, should I take a vaccine to protect others? That's a moral question. And so, our faith and our scientific views can intersect and do intersect all the time, but they really are asking and answering different questions. Really, your faith shouldn't be deciding whether the vaccine's effective. That's a scientific question. But whether you should take it to protect others, perhaps that's a question of morality. And, those are two different questions, and you can use these different epistemological systems to ask and answer these different questions. We conflate them all the time, but really, as Stephen Jay Gould famously said, there are no moral lessons in nature. Nature doesn't tell us about morality. That has to come from someplace else. And many people can get those moral lessons, they feel, from their faith. And so science doesn't tell you how to be a good person.
Yes, right. Although Sam Harris and Franz de Waal, these guys, they say something else, that it's there somehow.
Well, absolutely. There's definitely different viewpoints on this.
Yeah.
There are certainly scientists who are anti-religion, that's for sure. But in my perspective, I'm more of a Stephen Jay Gould type, where they're, as he called it, non-overlapping magisteria. He felt like I am explaining that they ask and answer different questions. And as I've mentioned, many people who are scientists can and do retain their faith. And their faith can even inform how they think about their work, not the answers to the scientific questions, but maybe even what questions they ask. So that there can be an intersection for some people in how they think about questions, but certainly science is about the natural world, and that's how it has to stay. And it doesn't investigate issues of faith. And in my view, it can't. I don't believe it can, because that's not of the natural world.
Yes. But then this certainly explains or shows the what religion or faith gives. It gives that identity, right? Which is what the people who don't believe in science, or the science deniers, they get that identity, the feeling of being in their tribe, and they also get that sort of emotional connection from there. So of course,
Right, we need a sense of community, right? Humans are social animals, and we need a sense of community, and everyone needs that. And so people often find that in their faith-based community, but there's other ways to find community as well. So it really is a matter of what kind of community do you want to be a part of, and can you be in a community, if you are a faith-based person, can you be in a community of faith that also accepts science?
Yes. But then how people can really leave their emotional biases, or sort of, that emotional connection with something, and then accept something else, because there should be at least similar level of comfort on the other side as well, right?
Well, you really can't leave emotions aside. We know from the work on neuroscience and emotions, some of which is done by my colleague, Mary Helen Immordino-Yang here at the University of Southern California, that emotions are how we think and reason. We think and reason through our emotions. And so you can't, quote, put emotions to the side. But what we must do is recognize that. We must recognize, as you just mentioned, that if you are rejecting a piece of science because your community told you to reject it, then that really isn't an evaluation of the science. That's just going with your identity group. And to be fair, this happens on the right of the political spectrum and on the left. So we do see people on the left who are anti-vaxxers. And this is the community that believes everything is all natural and all natural is best. And so you should just let nature take its course, and shouldn't put anything manufactured into your body. Well, that's a sort of more liberal view that is also anti-vax. And so it isn't the case that this is just one particular group on one side of the political or religious spectrum that struggles to align science with their pre-existing ideas about faith and politics. We see it on both sides.
Yes. Well, since we've been talking about two extremes, and especially about faith and all the people who don't believe in science, but then what is the role of politics? I still don't understand. It's so difficult to really understand, because when at the end there should be, because all the people who are elected, they are coming from the general public. Unfortunately, there are not scientists in the policymakers. So, but then, like, why to deny science?
Well, unfortunately, people use in politics what we call wedge issues. And so you can rile people up with wedge issues that are used to divide the electorate and get them on your side. And this happens, of course, one way or the other. And people have these strong feelings about science or about faith, and people who are politicians sometimes are taking advantage of those feelings to create a divide and bring people over to their side. And of course, that's most unfortunate that people are leveraging these wedge issues when really, as you mentioned, they may not understand the science even themselves.
Right. And what about the people who are neutral? I mean, we've been talking about the extreme people, but then there are, and I think most of the people, they are neutral, that they are not either on left or right. How to talk to them? Or
well, it's so true, and that's such an important point. We talk about the movable middle. We spend so much time talking about far right or far left or science acceptors and science deniers. But really, the majority of people are somewhere in the middle, and they can be moved. For example, with the vaccinations, we've seen that there were a lot of people who really simply had questions. Maybe they had misunderstandings about whether the vaccine could cause infertility or not. My niece was concerned about that. She's 30 years old. She wants to have children, and she was concerned about that. Well, once she talked to her doctor and got that concern allayed, she did get vaccinated. And then she went back to her Facebook friend who had shared that misinformation on Facebook and told her friend that it doesn't cause infertility. And her friend then got vaccinated. So we know that some of these folks just really want to get answers to what they find as very legitimate questions. And they are legitimate questions. If you're a young woman wanting to have children, that's a legitimate question, and you need to just get it answered. And there's a lot of people like that who are really just asking questions that they need answers to. And so what we would say when you talk to folks is to listen more than talk. Very few people change their minds when they've just been lectured to. Listen to what their concerns are and help them find information to address those concerns. And that's what you could do. A lot of people really did come to change their view about vaccines. We've seen that. There are still a lot of holdouts for sure. But over time, let's face it, millions and millions of people have been vaccinated, and many of them had questions at first and got those questions answered.
exactly. I mean, yeah, this is for sure that I think afterwards we did well, that a lot of people, they really went and they got vaccinated. Let's also talk about the opinions in the society. We are humans. We, at least in the social terms, we have free will, and so we have opinions as well. So how do we deal with this opinion thing? Because science doesn't have an opinion; it has a consensus of empirical evidence. So how do we deal with this, or how we balance it out?
It's such a great question, because that's absolutely right. Science isn't a matter of opinion. Opinion might be, where's the best Thai food in your neighborhood? And that's a good thing to crowdsource on social media, on your Facebook neighborhood page. Hey, where's the best Thai restaurant in Pasadena? And you might weigh the opinions of people who live around your neighborhood, and they may tell you the best one, and you'll find out when you go there. So there's a lot of things you can crowdsource where opinions are a perfectly good way to adjudicate information, but science isn't one of them. Science is it's really not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of facts and evidence. And another important point is it changes. And we saw how rapidly it changed during the course of the pandemic, and of course is still changing. And so understanding that science is not a matter of opinion, but that it will change with evidence, and does change with new evidence. And that's where we really need more and better science education in K through 12 and higher ed. And what I mean by better is teaching students about the nature of science. Why is it that science changes? How does science change? How do scientists know what they know? And that's something that we don't do enough. We kind of teach science as a collection of facts, which is not what science is. It's a process for finding out information. And as people learn more about that process, they might be more understanding of how we shift from, being afraid to touch our groceries at the beginning of the pandemic, to understanding that we must wear masks in a crowded environment with unvaccinated people. That shift came from new evidence. And as many people said, oh, scientists changed their opinion or their minds, not so much as they found new evidence, and that's how science works.
Exactly. But then it's, is there any correlation between, so in terms of education, if we start early, or if we, complete that knowledge deficit, means if the people don't know, we give them more knowledge, more information, does it work? Or it's the other way around, that we need to start early, educating basically children about science, and then it's more efficient, or somehow? Is there any correlation?
Well, I would definitely argue that start early is better, because children are natural scientists. And what I mean by that is children are curious, children are interested in the natural world, children want to ask and answer questions about the natural world. So we've done studies with children in kindergarten and having them ask questions and answer questions of their own interests that are scientific. And so you can start early. We recommend that you start early and capitalize on children's natural curiosity to ask and answer questions. And we recommend that you teach science. In the United States, we have something called the Next Generation Science Standards, which are recommended standards for teaching science as a practice. And while we do not have a national curriculum in the United States, we recommend states adopt the Next Generation Science Standards and teach science in that way. Some states have adopted them, but not all states in the United States. But it would be helpful if everyone took that approach of teaching science as a process, engaging students in asking and answering their own questions, doing their own experiments, their own inquiry. And that helps students understand the nature of science and the process of asking and answering questions.
Yes, exactly. But then what about that flexibility in the education system when it comes to science education? Because as you said, the science is changing so fast. And because of that, I also feel that no matter how much we'll try, the education system will be lagging behind in terms of information. So to also have that flexibility in the system where we can upgrade it or update it sooner than like after a longer period. The
Well,
question
right. I
is,
think, oh, I'm sorry. I think the whole key is teaching science as an evolving process so that people appreciate that the change is always happening in front of what we could possibly be teaching. So scientists are always working at that cutting edge of new information. And obviously we can't be teaching, you know, sixth graders the newest cutting edge science that's happening in labs somewhere, because that's just happening quicker than we can get it into the curriculum. But I think the answer to that is to be always teaching students about science as a process and an evolving process with new and important information coming out all the time, so that they are open to hearing that new information once they get to high school and they find out that something they learned in sixth grade is no longer true. I mean, an example would be, you know, Pluto was changed from planetary status to dwarf planetary status. And students in elementary school were pretty upset about that and didn't understand the process of how science changed. We did a research study on that that was really interesting. But as students find something out in sixth grade, they're going to find out it's different by the time they get to 10th grade. And if we teach science as an evolving process that changes based on new evidence, that should be less jarring to students.
exactly. Yes. I think one thing which scientific enterprise lacks is that there is no certain institution. There are no, you know, it's not like there is one place from where you can, like, if you want to know something, you can just go there and ask for information. It's something open, but then how does it work? What is it exactly? More and more you think about it, you feel like it's like money or something, you know, that the way it works. It exists, but where is it? So that's
Well, there is no doubt that it is difficult to source and find accurate scientific information. We definitely recommend, you know, following the CDC in the United States, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. But as we saw, you know, in a quickly evolving and somewhat politicized situation of the vaccination during the early parts of the pandemic, even the CDC was not 100% reliable all the time. So, you know, science is conducted by humans, and humans are fallible, and humans are subject to, you know, all the political pressures of anyone in any career. But certainly there are organizations like the CDC in the United States, like AAAS in the United States, and I'm sure you have them as well, that are scientific institutions that can be good sources. National Academy of Science is another one in the United States. But clearly, we need to do a better job teaching the public about what are reliable sources of scientific information. Most people don't know.
right. One thing which I really liked about your book is the 3 sections at the end of each chapter: what general public can do, what scientists can do, and what science communicators can do in general. I think that was really good, that there are action plans, and if people, they really want to do something, they can just go through it and get those insights. Let's
Yes,
just
thank you. We definitely include action steps for individuals, educators, scientists, science communicators, policymakers. And we do that in every chapter. And then we have a whole chapter at the end that sort of brings that all together, because really one of the main reasons to structure the book that way is everyone, well, not everyone, but most people understand there's a challenge with science literacy and science denial. But so that wasn't particularly brand new, but what we feel we've brought to the conversation is that we can do something about it.
exactly. Let's just briefly sort of try to give those points for the individuals, what they can do, maybe just few points, and then what communicators can do and what educators can do.
Certainly. So what individuals can do is what we've been talking about a lot today together, which is be thoughtful about where you look for information for scientific topics. and be very cautious about what you share with other people. You have to be thoughtful about sharing information unless you vetted it. So we have steps for how to vet information, and you should take those steps. You should not share clickbait headlines about how eating chocolate in the morning helps you lose weight. That you should definitely not share that unless you find a lot more information that supports that. So as an individual, you should definitely be thoughtful about how you source and share information. And for educators, you can teach the process of science, the nature of science. Learn more about that yourself and teach it to your students. Teach students not only digital literacy, but algorithmic literacy. In other words, what we talked about early on in our conversation today, that the first source that pops up on Google is not necessarily correct, and how you would know how to find that more valid information by doing the lateral reading, meaning opening up new windows and trying to find the sources of information. We want teachers to teach science as a process, as we've been talking about, and teaching students to adopt a scientific attitude, as Lee McIntyre talks about in his work. For scientists, we want them to communicate more about their work and learn how to do so in an accessible way for the public. For science communicators and journalists, we want them to communicate more. They're doing a great job, but there's too few of them, and they're overwhelmed by so much science coming at us all the time. So more people hopefully will join the science communication parts of journalism to help scientists get their work out and to help the public better understand scientific information. We've seen the dire need for that this past year during the pandemic. And for policymakers, we would really like them to have science advisors and to rely on the scientific information to inform their policy decisions. That's so important. We have seen across the globe the differences in how policies have played out, who have relied more on the science or less on the science. Portugal's done particularly well with vaccination rates and COVID rates. And one of the reasons is that they have depoliticized it. In the United States, it got very politicized, and we have seen the consequences of that have been dire. So we would like policymakers to utilize science in an informed way to make better decisions for the safety and well-being of citizenry and the health of the planet.
Yes, that's fantastic. What do you think about scientists as politicians?
Well, I certainly think we need more of them. We need more science-informed or scientifically minded or scientists themselves to seek political office. There's no question that would be better. There's too few. There's a couple of doctors in the United States in the Senate, and I think that's about it. Very few. There's I think we have an astronaut. We have a couple of people who are very familiar with science in Congress and in our Senate, but the numbers are extremely small. So there is no reason why people who are scientifically minded, trained as scientists, or actually had a science career shouldn't consider entering a political sphere to help us better adjudicate so many scientific issues that confront us today.
Exactly. I mean, many times I talk to one of my uncle, and I always complain about the policymakers and politicians not doing the correct job. And this is what he asked me, that why not more scientists are becoming politicians than, and I simply don't have any answer. But maybe because science is so great, and like it's so difficult once you are so curious to leave it and just do politics properly.
Well, I think unfortunately different types of people go into those two realms. So I think people who like to perhaps quietly be in the field investigating geology aren't the same people who like to be in front of a crowd of people at a political rally. So I understand why that might not be, but I would encourage anyone who has had a scientific career, who's interested in politics, to consider that. It's a rough and tumble business, we see, of course, but there's no question that it would be better if we had, clearer understanding of scientific issues while we're trying to fight pandemics and global warming.
Exactly. Okay, so this was a great discussion. So what is new coming from your side? More writing, more research, new
Yes, we
collaborations?
are definitely doing more writing and more research. Hopefully we'll do another book together in the future. Certainly engaged right now in a lot of informal science learning myself. So we have projects where we're helping the public learn about science in informal settings like museums.
Interesting. Actually, a couple of days back, I had one workshop on this bias, the sexual bias, gender bias in science, and that was really interesting idea. And I wanted to ask you whether you guys are also planning on like certain workshops on science denial or something.
Well, we've certainly done a number of podcasts, and we have those popping all over the place. So you can find us on a number of podcasts. We've done a little more than a dozen of them now. And we've certainly given lectures that are also available on YouTube. So your audience can find us on YouTube sharing a lot more of these ideas.
Perfect. And apart from psychology of science denial, what people can read more about the topic?
Absolutely. We already mentioned Lee McIntyre's book. Catherine Hayhoe has a new one out. Naomi Oreskes has Why Trust Science, an excellent volume that I would recommend to your readership. So I think this is a topic where you'll find other related volumes to ours out there, and hopefully they'll all come together to help people understand science a little better.
Perfect. Thank you so much for great discussion. And
thank you, Jitender. It's
best
been really great.
Thank you.
It's been great talking with you. We appreciate your interest in our work.
Yes, it's amazing work.
Thank you.
Thank you.